Welcome to Seminary of the Third Age, the final in our May series. Tonight we have the one and only Norm Habel. Now I'll introduce him in a moment, but first some housekeeping. Please turn your mobile phones onto silent. The toilets, if you need them, are out these sliding doors in the foyer to the left and right. And please, of course, join us for supper afterwards. Let's have our acknowledgement of First Peoples. In the spirit of reconciliation, support for the Uluru Statement from the heart, and a constitutional voice, we acknowledge that we gather on the land of the Kaurna people whose spiritual sovereignty flows through the generations. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We give thanks for the opportunity to live among First Nations people who are part of the oldest living culture on earth. So, Dr. Norm Habel, renowned pastor, teacher, biblical scholar and writer of children's stories, author of over 50 books, and there's a couple here that he edited tonight which he's going to use in his presentation, in fact. Norm describes himself as a biblical buff who has specialised in reading the Bible from many different points of view, including literary, ecological and theological. He has also had a special personal interest in the wisdom school of thought reflected in books like the Book of Job. In recent years, especially, he has worked with First Nations Australia to develop a decolonising hermeneutic. I thought I was speaking rather grandly, so I think that was a very appropriate little bit of backing music. So in recent years, as I said, Norm has been working with First Nations Australian people to develop a decolonising hermeneutic. Tonight, Norm is speaking on decolonising Genesis 1, but do you know that this presentation is being filmed for use at a conference in Bethlehem, Palestine, later this year? So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norm Habel to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Norman Habel. I'm an Old Testament buff, and I've been translating and interpreting the Old Testament for some 70 years. About 25 years ago, I was in Bethlehem for a conference on land. And at that conference, we were all sitting there, and one day we looked out to the east, and there was a lovely mound covered with trees. As we watched that, we looked at that mound, suddenly a tractor came and started to knock all the trees down, all the trees on that mound. And I asked, why? How could that be? And the answer was terra nullius. The Israeli government declared that piece of land terra nullius because there was nobody legally living on the land. Terra nullius. That rang a bell. Terra nullius is the very same expression that's used when the British decided to come and colonise Australia. Not terra australis, but terra nullius. And that connection with terra nullius and the whole colonial curse of the past that the Aboriginal people, First Nations people have informed me about is very important, and it's the background to this whole discussion tonight. Terra nullius, and the land where I am is the land of the First Nations people. Anne Patel Gray and I were at a conference some years ago, and we both gave papers together on similar topics. The question of, was there a precedent for the whole question of the Uluru Statement and the treaty process? And I said there was. she said there was, and she then invited me to be involved with her in trying to decolonize the biblical narrative. And that's what I plan to do tonight, helping, and I'll start primarily with Genesis 1. But Genesis 1 really provides a core concept, a core understanding of all of Genesis 1 to 11. And so here we go. The birth of land is the primary theme of my presentation. The birth of land. If I'm going to do an interpretation of Genesis 1 or the whole of Genesis 1 to 11, I need to be able to proceed and partly decolonize my mind, because I grew up with the colonial perspective, both from my neighborhood as well as from the church. I didn't fully realize it until I worked with the Aboriginal people here in Australia. So then I also needed to say, with Anne, how do we develop a hermeneutic, a set of steps that enable us to decolonize the biblical text? So that's a major step forward. And the third thing would be, how would the First Nations people respond to what we are doing and how we're interpreting? So, decolonizing hermeneutics. There are three basic steps. Three steps. The first step is, well, to recognize that previous translations and interpretations are likely to have been that of colonial people. Whether we like it or not, whether they knew it or not, they were part of that colonial world. But then we discovered, that it wasn't just the translation and the interpretation, that there was within the Bible itself two major streams in those early narratives, one which was pre-colonial and the other one was colonial. I didn't fully appreciate that until I went into the text. So we had to be aware of the colonial. Second step is exposure. How do we expose or reveal or discern colonial language, colonial bias, colonial perspective? And third then, going from that point, how do I retrieve pre-colonial narratives that are there in the text? And can I retrieve colonial narratives that have been coloured, edited by a colonial editor? And that's the process. Now, how does Genesis 1 start? What's the colonial tradition? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. And darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. That's the traditional text that we have. But if I go back to the Hebrew and have decolonized my mind and look at the actual words that are there, what is the translation that one discovers? Here it is now. When God began to transform the sky and the land was formless mass, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the wind of God hovered over the face of the waters. That's the translation that comes if you're aware of all the terms. And what are the key terms that are interpreted? The first word is bara. Now, bara is regularly translated as creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. But if you actually read and look at all the references to bara all through the Old Testament, you discover it doesn't have to do with creation out of nothing at all. It has to do with forming, molding, splitting apart, all kinds of everything, everyday things. Creation out of nothing is a theological addition, not the actual text. The second word, now this is crucial, is the word eretz. Eretz is translated as earth, and we associate that with planet Earth, but there was no planet in their minds back in those days, was there? Not in the days of Moses. And so eretz is actually the everyday word for land. The land of Canaan, the land of Israel, it's the ordinary everyday word for land. And that's the key concept that runs all the way through Genesis 1 and all the way through Genesis 1 to 11. Eretz. And the other key word is Shemayim. That's been translated as heaven, but it has nothing to do with heaven, that place where God's supposed to be living. Shemayim means sky. So the text is about the sky and the land. And the last key term there is ruach. Ruach is the normal everyday word for wind. Often it's translated as spirit, but it's the wind of God that blows across the waters. So the scene that is there is water, primordial scene. What exists is water, darkness, a lump inside the water called the land, and the wind of God blowing over the waters. That's the scene. What are the implications of that? Well, the implications are that land existed before any of this process happened. The land exists in the darkness. The land is like I would say, like an embryo, deep in the waters, in the dark waters, an embryo waiting to be born. And the wind of God is not some celestial being, but the process of the Spirit of God in and through and with the waters to transform the whole show. That's important. And this is very much in sympathy with the perspective of the First Nations people, the way things began. Land has always been there as a spiritual force and reality. So if we now go and say, what about the sky? The first verses are about how God transforms the darkness into darkness and life in the first verses 6 to 8. And then comes the actual details about the sky. God said, let there be a canopy in the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And happened, and God called the canopy, or named the canopy, what? Sky. So that's the sky, is that ceiling, and there are waters above it, and there are waters below it, and a space between, where earth can be born, earth can be seen, earth can appear. That's the transformation. That's how God transforms the waters. The waters have always been there, but they've been transformed so that there is a ceiling above the waters, keeping one lot of waters above and one below. And what are the key terms there? Rakia. That's a canopy, a ceiling, not some kind of air. It is a ceiling where the water is above. And the other key term, of course, is Shemayim, is the sky. That's the ceiling where water is above and where God later on locates the lights and places the lights. And the lights are there to locate, to light the land. Now, then comes the key text. Land is born. Now, I'd like, if you're delighted, I'd like us to read this text together, because this is the core beginning text. Together we go. Then God said, shall we go? Then God said, let the waters below the sky come together into one place, and let the ground appear. And it happened. And God named the ground land. So that's the scene. What is it about? Well, Ra'ah is the word to be seen, to be appear, And it's used also of God appearing. It's a very, very important term in the biblical tradition. God appears, and here land appears from beneath the waters. Or if you like, the waters burst and the baby is born. Earth comes forth. And when you have a baby, what do? You name the baby. And this baby is called land. That's very, very specific text here. And so my understanding that the birth of land, its naming and its reality are crucial to understand this pre-colonial text, this traditional ancestral text. Then what happens? The land comes alive. God comes and says, let the land come alive. And how do you know this come alive with vegetation, plants yielding seed, trees bearing fruit, in which there is seed, according to which kind upon the land. Yeah. So there are key concepts. The land comes alive. It's therefore understood to be a vibrant part of the universe. And evidence of that being alive is the vegetation. And that land is alive is true for the First Nations people of this country and maybe for others. Land is alive. It's alive, and therefore that's why the Aboriginal people read the landscape and communicate with the land. It's alive. Then God says, let there be lights in the canopy of the sky to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and let there be lights in the ceiling of the sky. Why? To give light to the land. So the land continues to be a focal concern in the sequence of the text. The lights in the sky, not in heaven, the lights in the sky to give light and give seasons to the land that's there below. The lights in the sky. Yes. Then, in the preceding verses in 20 and 23, you have the sea and the sky coming alive as well. But then, in verse 24, you have this. And God said, let the land bring forth each according to its kind, animals, creeping creatures, and the land, life according to its kind, and it happened. In other words, you have a co-creator. Land also brings forth life. Land brings forth all the animal life that's on the land. God doesn't create the life. God doesn't create the life. Land is a co-creator. See? Creeping. And God doesn't create that life, the land does. Land continues to be a central force, a vibrant force in the tradition. And, well, if life, that makes it not Mother Earth, but Mother Land. It's the mother for all the living creatures. Now, if there were no following later on texts, the logical progression of this text would be that what else is created by land? Human beings. And if Genesis 2 actually do come out of the ground. But here, that would be the logical progression, because life and everything else, land is alive and it brings forth the life of all the other things. But then something happens. Something happens. Well, given all we've had, why don't we say happy birthday, land? What? Happy birthday, land. Yes. Happy birthday, because land was born, and we need to celebrate that land gives us life and continues to do that. Land, happy birthday, land. But now we move on, because what happens in the text, we move from this wonderful pre-colonial text to a colonial edition, which is in direct contrast to what we've just heard. Pre-colonial worldview was central. Now, a second turn, the colonial edition overrides the previous one, and these new verses are a whole colonial edition with colonial language and terminology which are completely in tension, completely in conflict with the first 25 verses. All right, this is how it reads. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over domestic animals, and over the land. The land, which was then previously such a wonderful force, a life-giving force, is now submitted to being under the dominion of humans. Right. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the land and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and every creature that creeps on the land. Have dominion and subdue. Well, what are these technical terms all about? Let's take a look. The word image, normally it means a graven image, like a statue of some sort. But in this context and other contexts, the image of God is that humans reflect the power of God, the dominion of God, the rulership of God. What we have here are human kings. Human beings are the kings of creation, according to this portrayal, according to this text, the rulers of the land. Adam, human beings, is made of Adamah, land creatures or ground creatures, but this text makes them a little higher than that. They are beings who are like God, have the power to rule over like God. And the two key terms are Radah, rule. That word means to rule like an emperor or a king. You rule like a emperor or a king over the rest of creation, over the animals and beasts and so on. You are an emperor over them. And kabash. Kabash is the term crush. It's translated often as subdue. It means crush in many, many texts. And in some texts it even means rape. Rape the land. So it's a cruel, harsh set of terms. The human beings are to dominate, control, and rule the rest of creation. That's what this text is about. It's the opposite of the text about land that we had earlier. So what are the implications? Well, human beings are given the power to colonize the land, overpower all life. And that's the basis of the Christian doctrine of colonial control. You can go and control over the land when you conquer it, just like Joshua did, just like the British did. The portrayal of land as a celebrated core of creation which is alive is downgraded to being a domain to be crushed and subdued. Yeah. And the First Nations people find this very, very evil, wrong, contrary to their whole understanding of their relationship to the land. Why should the land be crushed, subdued like that? Now, often you see what happens is that That's the colonial edition. But there are some options. Pre-colonial options. What if, in fact, there was an original understanding, and it wasn't imago Dei, but it was imago terrae? If human beings were born of the land, then that would be their understanding. Land is the co-creator, so why couldn't human beings be born imago terrae? And in some texts of the Bible, that's very much the case. Now in Genesis 2, version of this origin of humans, Adam is assigned to be what? A custodian of the land. Look at this text. Then God took, look at the right one? Yeah, God took the ground being called Adam and put him in the bushland, or the land, or the garden. Sometimes it's translated garden, but it wasn't really a garden. It was a lot of timber, trees. Garden of Eden, to serve and preserve it. What? The key terms that are there, next section, the key terms that are there, go back. The key terms that are there are serve and preserve. The term for serve, abad, is actually to serve as a servant. Abad is the absolute diametric opposite of radar for rule. This text is the opposite. Rule is in the imago Dei, and serve is in this text. Also, shamar, to preserve, is the opposite of crush and subdue. So you have a text here in which you have the opposite role of human beings. They're not to rule over the land, but serve the land. Isn't that amazing, having two absolutely contrary texts? One is pre-colonial and the other one is unbelievably colonial. By the way, just by something, sometimes the text is not translated as, serve at all. It's translated as till the land, as if that word were the word for agriculture, but it has nothing to do with agriculture. Abad is a normal, everyday word for serve. You follow? It's crucial that we understand how diametrically opposed those two texts are. And you can go through the rest of Genesis 1 to 11 and you find comparable contrasts. I'll just go for one little aside. After Eve has had the the fruit, the tree of knowledge and good and evil, and Adam has some, their eyes are opened. And you say, wow, that's amazing. But then comes the colonial edition. Because of what you've done, I'm going to pronounce 5 curses. Do you know the 5 curses? The first curse is for the snake. He's got to wriggle forever. Second, 2 curses are for the woman. First curse is that when you have babies, you're going to have pain and anguish. Second curse, you have to obey your man all the time. Then 2 curses at the end. One curse, the ground gets cursed, and it has to be worked real hard to get any fertility out of it, or vegetation. And Adam gets cursed. He has to work like hell to till the ground. And so you've got texts like that that appear elsewhere in Genesis. And I'll close with a discussion about the flood. There are 2 flood narratives. One version is pre-colonial and one is very colonial. And one lasts for 40 days and 40 nights, and one lasts for 12 months and 10 days. 2 different flood stories. But at the end of the second flood story, you've got this quote here. Yeah? God blessed Noah and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the land. The fear of you and the dread of you will be on every animal in the land." So the whole ruling over the land becomes a terrifying of the creatures of the land. That's the portrayal of the colonial ruler. You want to be like that? And then it continues to say, whoever sheds blood is in trouble because human beings are in the image of God. That whole Imago Dei theme and colonial ruling is there in explicit language in Genesis at the end of the flood, story number 2. So the implications, yes, colonize and terrify all the land. Humans still in the image of God, but they cannot kill anybody. But they still bear the image of God. So you get that colonial tradition is continuing in spite of the pre-colonial, wonderful colonial story in Genesis 1. And then comes the finale. After the 2 endings to the flood story, you get this story. This is the sign of the treaty between you and me and every living creature who is with you. I will set a rainbow in the sky, in the clouds, and it will be a sign of a treaty between me and the land. The whole centrality of the land as a crucial and a violent and a special relationship with us and with God persists in the pre-colonial narratives. And Genesis 9, the creations, the rainbow story is very important, partly because of key terms. The term berit is often rendered covenant, but here in other texts it means treaty, because a treaty in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world, always had a sign, some witness, some testimony. And so here is the rainbow is the witness to the treaty that God has to recognize. And God has therefore a special relationship with the land to be preserved forever. This treaty is an agreement never to destroy life or the land again, as in the second flood story. So the core of all of this is the land. The land is pivotal from beginning to end. And in conclusion, this is what I would say. 4 things about land that are pivotal for the Genesis 1 to 11, but highlighted because of the birth of land in Genesis 1. Land is a primordial presence. It's there from the beginning, like a special sacred embryo. Land is born, is revealed, and then is named. Yes? Then land is alive, becomes alive with vegetation. Land is then to be served, not tilled or ruled or crushed. Land has a treaty with God, and God will respect and remember his treaty with the land. The land is the bond of the First Nations people of this country, and we need to celebrate it. And on behalf of the first peoples of this nation, I would like to recommend that we too celebrate the birth of the land, the importance of the land, and our kinship with the land the way they do. Thank you very much indeed for being part of this analysis of land, the centrality of land, the birth of the land, and the treaty of the land with our God. Thank you.
Now, stay right there, Norm, because it's question time.
Yeah, we can do that.
So, does anybody stick your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone over and feel free to ask questions of Norm.
Thank you, Norm, for your clarity in everything you have shared with us tonight. I'm just sort of asking a little bit about the little bit that you describe as the colonial insertion in Genesis 1,
Yeah.
seeing that that particular story comes from the post-exilic era,
Well, that's
after
that's
their... hold on, let me finish.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm wrong, you can tell me, but
Yeah.
I understood it to be when they returned from exile, that's when they put these scriptures together. And this first creation story resonates a lot with creation stories of Mesopotamia, of Babylon. But was it there, when they were in exile, they observed the way power plays were paid by emperors and kings and whatever, and the way they ruled, and that influenced them in putting into the text what you described today, particularly with the words like dominion and ruling and all that stuff. Do you think that might have been something they brought from their experience in exile?
Not necessarily. It might have continued to be part of it, but if you actually take a look at the portrayal of Yahweh, the God of Israel, in Exodus, and then what it portrays, he is the God who demands that you obey him and that he is the ruler, and they are supposed to rule like him. They conquer the land of Canaan, right? They colonize the land of Canaan in the name of the God of Israel, who's a colonial God. So the whole idea of being the ruler, colonial ruler, that they should become like that, well, that's when and where exactly how that emerged. Historically, how the colonial dimension of Genesis 1 emerged is historically still a question mark, in my opinion. I don't necessarily think it's connected with the exile. I think it could be preceded, but could be before that. Yeah.
Hi. I'm just wondering what language the Bible was originally written in. In an old Bible that I've got there, it says translated from the original Greek. But, could you enlighten me?
Yes, I can help you there. Back in 1962, I got my PhD. And my PhD was about the Canaanite language, which then was called Ugaritic, because they found a whole lot of Ugaritic texts in a place called Ugarit in north. And those texts were all about Baal and El, the creator god El, and a number of other gods. But the crucial thing is that language preceded the Hebrew language. And a lot of the certain number of quotes, certain number of texts, traditions that are there in those Ugaritic texts, which I read when I was young and intelligent, those texts appear in part in the Old Testament. Psalm 29 is really a psalm about Baal, but the name God, Yahweh, has been added. Exodus 15 has very strong parallels with texts in the Ugaritic or Canaanite texts. So you've got the development of Hebrew, partly from what they brought with them from Egypt, and partly their interaction with the land of Canaan, the Ugaritic, that developed into Hebrew. So it goes way back, and so the beginnings, what was first written, is a big question mark. But writing was already there when Israel entered Canaan. So it's not just in the exile, but there was oral traditions and there were writing traditions very early in the piece as well. Oh, the Greek is later. That's a later time, later material. That's when the New Testament comes into the picture. Yeah, but prior to that, Jesus spoke Aramaic, which is a version of Hebrew. Yeah.
Just on that, Norm, but the Septuagint, was that
What?
Greek? That was the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Septuagint was,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so wouldn't the translators from Greek, from their, you might call it colonial mindset,
Yeah.
in translating it, wouldn't they perhaps therefore have given that, put a sort of an emphasis in their translation into Greek,
Yeah.
which is passed on to us because many of our
Yeah.
translations
Yeah.
come from the Greek and not from the Hebrew. Is that
That's
right?
true. Yes, that's possibly true. But in some cases, you find a Hebrew text which has, which is different from the Greek text. In other words, the Greek text has deleted something that was in the old original Hebrew. Yeah. Well, variations. It's a whole process of comparing the two. You know. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, the Greek text is a translation, but in the translation process, some things get lost. That's if you want to use that word, yeah.
Thanks very much, Norm. You've always got interesting things to keep our brains thinking.
Oh, I hope so.
Absolutely. I'm just trying to, the term colonialisation is sort of, in my head, is very much a part of the 19th century and the 17th century. And so is there a better term than that? Because, I mean, what you seem to be saying is that there was a more aboriginal, I shouldn't even use that term, a more original description of the creation, and then to that original description, people who saw humans above creation came and redacted that in an imperialist or colonial way. So that's what you're saying, is it?
Yes.
Right, okay. I guess I'm also wondering whether it's also possible that they had a basic understanding, and then through consciousness of human beings over against animals, the consciousness which only came into human beings somehow, biologically, which is all the rage at the moment with science trying to work out why we are conscious beings, over against an animal which isn't a conscious being in the same sense, or a reflective being, whether that was another dimension, in a sense, in a positive dimension, if it was used in the right way, that was another surface layer of looking at creation, that creation was in itself there, but then human beings had this added dimension above creation, which if it was kept in the right way, could have worked out.
If you notice the First Nations people, they have a kinship with the creatures of creation. Not so much a question of ruling, but of kinship, of relationship, positive relationship, of how you're supposed to treat them and be custodians of the land, you know?
Although and I don't want to be negative about the Aboriginal people, but just in terms of your concept of simply leaving the land as it is, I mean, we know that the Aboriginals burnt the land with fire.
Oh yes, but they were positive burnings.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what I'm arguing, that the consciousness of the ruling could also be, if you can have a benign ruler as well.
Yeah.
So I think if in that sense I would agree that, and I think that's understood, that the fire is to be positive, but I would argue that, and I'm not dismissing any of the aspects of us being very much a part of the ground and the land, but I'm just putting it that maybe it can be both and.
Yeah. Well.
But, thank you for highlighting both of those things and the contrast between them too.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get to talk about these because it didn't show up, but there are 2 volumes now which we have done. Decolonising the Biblical Narrative, Volume 1, which is Genesis 1 to 11, and Volume 2, which is 12 to 25, and this whole process of all the hermeneutic of how we do it and so forth is outlined at the beginning, and the processes are there. And the sort of many of the things that I talked about tonight are in Volume 1, So if you want to go further, those are available now through ATF Press. Okay,
Now, no more questions?
thank you very
One-
much.
One more from Jess, I think.
With the colonial version versus the original version, I could only picture the transformation of the word to dominate or control or work with to be a manipulation on human side to benefit the growth of colonial ideals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Norm. Sorry to ask another kind of a question or comment, but I mean, I want to say that I think the beauty of what you've done and what you are doing is to raise the question of what's the nature of the relationship we have to, I'm going to call it the created order, but you know, the land and you know, the universe. In a time when we live in what's called the Anthropocene,
Yeah.
when it is quite clear that human beings are recrafting well, I will use the word the planet, in a way that's making it so toxic that the future of life on Earth is in
threat.
peril.
Yeah.
Therefore, all the ways we can, and I think what you contribute is towards getting us to rethink what's that fundamental relationship to have with, and I'll use the James Lovelock word, Gaia, to talk about that which sustains all life on Earth. But I mean, the fact that human beings, in one sense, dominate is what we have to live with now because of the consequences of particularly the capitalist form of political economy, which we live with. Therefore, to rethink what is the kind of relationship that might allow us to restore and swing the dial back to that different kind of relationship, whereby we might actually be able to restore the balance of the biosphere in a way to ensure that life goes on. And it's going to be human beings who are going to do that, not God.
Exactly. Just one more little comment. Talking about land, our connection, there's a famous passage that I've used a number of times in Psalm 139, which says, what you should really know is that I was secretly formed. Where? In the womb of the earth, the womb of the land. Yeah, I'm an earth being. I'm a land being. Okay.
On that beautiful note, that was great. Thank you, Norm. Let's give Norm another round of applause for his presentation tonight. That was wonderful. Please join us for supper in a moment. But let me tell you about, before you do that, let me tell you about next time at Seminary of the Third Age. There we go. We have a break now until August, and the first in our August series is with Jason John and the Environmental Action Group. It's the third in our eco-theology series that we've had at the start of each of the, firstly the March and then the May series, and now the start of the August series. And it's on a similar theme, First Nations wisdom in caring for creation. So book your tickets for that. That's August the 3rd. So now, thank you very much. Please join us for supper.
Didn't fall asleep? Good.